So .NET 7 is officially out and released along with Entity Framework 7, which is its newest version. So let's cover what it takes to build a .NET 7 CRUD API. So that means we're going to be doing the basic create, read, update, and delete methods, along with using the repository pattern to help set up our API. We're also going to be taking full advantage of dependency injection, and we're going to be using EF7 to access our database. So let's dive into how to create a .NET 7 API. And if you end up finding this video helpful, please drop a like so it can spread to more developers on YouTube. Thank you. But before we start this project, we do need to cover the fact, in case you do not have .NET 7 already installed, you do have to go out and download it before you can actually use it within Visual Studio. So let me show you guys how to actually install .NET 7 so we can start actually using it with our API. So to download .NET 7, you go to .net.microsoft.com/the .NET 7 link, and you're going to come down here and you're going to find the SDK that you need for whatever OS that you are on. Once you download it and you install it all the way, it's super simple. And something else that you do need to know if you're installing .NET 7 is that you do need Visual Studio 2022. You need higher than this certain version. So keep that in mind in case you do not have it. That might be why .NET 7 doesn't appear for you. You're now going to go back and you're going to go to your Visual Studio installer, because if you try and open up an old project or create a new project thinking, oh, .NET 7 is fine, ready to go. No, you're going to see that it doesn't appear. It doesn't come up in any drop-down list. So you're going to have to come into your installer and then you're going to see an update and you're going to update it. Once you update it, now you actually have .NET 7 correctly installed. And to test it, you can go and create a project or open up an old one. In our case, I'm going to actually create the API that we'll be using in this tutorial, and I'm going to show you guys that .NET 7 is installed. So I'm going to create this API. I'm going to name it .NET 7 API YT. I'm going to step through. And if you have .NET 7 correctly installed, you should see it come up on this dropdown and you should be able to select it here. Or if you are trying to upgrade an older project, if you right click the solution and go to properties, you should see a similar type of list and you should be able to select .NET 7 as the target framework there. But now that we have .NET 7 selected, let's click it and let's create this project. Our API has now been created. I removed the default weather stuff. And now, what project am I going to create tonight? Well, the API I'm going to create with the World Cup coming up is going to be one that serves up a handful of teams that are going to be participating in the World Cup. And each team will be tied to their confederation. So, example, Mexico is part of CONCACAF, as France is part of UEFA. So we're going to have that in our database, which I will show you guys in a bit. But for right now, let's start off with the controller, which will be the start off point, the launching pad for our API. So as you guys can see, I created this team controller. The team controller is going to represent, every country has a team. And that's what we're doing here, and that's why I named it that way. So first things first, I want this to be controller based because I am not going to be using any views. Now let's actually decorate our controller with what it needs. So it's going to be an API controller, and we're going to give it its route. Next thing, I'm going to move these using statements to the program.cs. I think it just makes the application just cleaner in general. So just move these here, and now we can access them anywhere, and I think it just helps, especially once we add models, repositories, and different things. I think it just makes your controllers and your repositories going forward just a little bit cleaner. Now coming back to our team controller, we're going to need a constructor. And the first method we're going to have is our GetTeams. So this will just get all the teams that we have in our database. So our GetTeams will be an async method. It will return a task of iActionResult. So now let's actually fill out what's going to be inside of GetTeams. There's not going to be anything crazy, just a try catch with our team repository, which we will create in a second, calling a method called GetAllTeams. Again, like I said, we're getting all the teams here, returning the teams with OK, and if we get any errors in the repository, throw a bad request. Now let's move on to our next method. This is going to be GetTeamById. This is going to be another HttpGet in which we just take the team ID, pass it in, and just get the team that we want. And the code to this will look very similar to the GetTeams, and it's just going to be passing in that ID into the repository that we haven't created yet. And we have this GetTeamById method. Once we get the team, we return it. If we have any errors, we return bad requests. And now the next method that we have is actually creating a new team to add to our database. This is going to be an HttpPost called AddTeam. We're going to be getting a team object, and we're going to be sending that as well to our repository. And as you can see, again, a try catch with calling this AddTeam method in our repository, and then again, just checking for any exceptions. The fourth method that we have is going to be our HttpPut, which is our EditTeam. So this one's when we need to make some type of update to a certain team for any given reason. This is the method for that. Our code is going to look very similar. Again, another try catch. We're going to be returning the amount of rows affected and then return OK once we call the edit team on the repository, or returning, bad request with whatever exception. And our final method will be our HttpDelete delete team. This will be done using a team ID. And this is what the method looks like, delete team. And our code will be, again, a try catch with the delete team in the repository, getting a team ID, then returning the amount of rows affected, and if there's any error, again, bad request. So now that we have all our methods defined here, I want to show you guys what database I am using so you guys have a little bit more context around it, as well as how we can actually, since we are database first, and that is the approach that I usually go with, how to actually scaffold your DBContext and all your models in so that you can actually have this team model that I'll be using here, and then we can go back and create our repository and continue the implementation of this. So let me show you guys what our DB looks like, and then how using Entity Framework 7 we can scaffold all our models and DBContext in here. So as you guys can hopefully see, we are now in SSMS. This is the database I'm using. It's just called sample database. Straight up, we have two tables, like I mentioned already, the team table, and like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the confederations table. So let's open this so you guys can see what is a part of the team. We have just a team ID, the country's name, and then the confederation ID. This is pointing to the confederation table that just has an ID and a name. And if we select this, you guys can see what teams we have. We have France, Brazil, Mexico, Germany, Japan, Ghana, USA, Spain, Qatar, and England. And they are all pointing to the respective confederations. And we can see which ones are here. As you guys can see, we have all of them here. But this is the database that we're going to be using. And now let's switch over to Entity Framework 7, how to install it, how to get it going, how to now scaffold these two tables into models and our DB context, so that then finally we can go back to our repository and get the whole API running. Now that we're back at the project, before I forget, let's go to our app settings and set up our connection string in here. One thing that is very important that I want you guys to pay attention to now that we're using Entity Framework 7 and .NET 7 is that there is a tiny switch when it comes to your connection string. And that is that now you need to have this trust server certificate equals true. This is very important because when you actually try and sign in and connect to your database using EF7, it now needs this. If not, it won't trust the connection and you will get an error. And if you're confused, it's probably because you forgot to put this. But now the next thing is we actually need to make sure that we have Entity Framework 7 installed globally on our machine. So to do that, we need to run a command. So I opened up terminal, and if you've already done some type of development, you probably have just an older version of .NET EF, and you just need to globally update this. And the command to do that is going to be .NET tool update -- global .NET EF. This will push your version up to version 7 from whatever it may have been at, and this will set you up so now you have globally EF at 7+. And then you can actually install all the other Nuget packages that you need for your single project. And now you may be asking, well, what are those Nuget packages that we need? Well, if we look for them, you'll see that there are a handful that we're going to need. We're going to need Entity Framework Core, so get the latest version of that. We will also need Entity Framework Core .SQL Server, so get the latest version of that. Entity Framework Core .design, so add that one in as well. And finally, you're going to need Entity Framework Core .tools. Once you have all these installed and you have their latest stable 7+ or wherever it may be at, you now have everything you need to actually go ahead now and scaffold our DB context and our models from our DB. And right before I scaffold in our models in our DB context, I want to make the folders necessary so that we have our project set up correctly. So what is actually the command to scaffold in your model and your DB context? Well, it's this one, .NET EF, the name of your context, whatever you want to call it, DB context in my case, scaffold the connection string to your database. Remember to include trust server certificate equals true. If not, this is where you're going to get that error. And then the package for SQL Server Entity Framework Core, this flag for O, which is output, which is where you're actually going to send what you create, which is this models folder. And then you're going to force it, which this just means in the future, if you've already created models and you make changes on the database and you want to scaffold new ones, this will just overwrite what you have and it won't give a conflict that, oh, this already exists. And I just kind of do it out of force of habit. But before I actually run this command, I'm going to get an error because, as you guys can see, I haven't created the repository. So what I'm going to do really quick is just comment the controller out so that we get no errors when this builds. We should have no more errors now. And now I can run this freely. And now let's actually create these things in Scaffold. So the command executed very fast. As you can see, I went back and already uncommented my controller, and let's look at our models. So we already have our DBContext, then we have our team and our confederation. So let's look at the confederation model. It is, again, like I said, it was just the two things, the confederation ID and confederation name, like we had right here. Let's look at the design, just those two things. That's all we had here. And then our team, we have our team ID, country name, confederation ID, and then, you know, that foreign key reference, which is, again, very close to what we have here, these three, and then that foreign key relationship. And then finally, we just have our DB context. But now that we actually have our models, as you guys can see, I can probably pull in this team model right here. Let's pull that in. And then I'm going to take this and, again, put it globally up at the front because it just makes everything just a little easier for us. Get rid of that. Now we can delete this from our controller. And now that we've created our controller, have our database, and have actually scaffolded our DB context and have our two models, now we can actually create our repository, create the interface, and start connecting all of these two things together. I'm going to go ahead and create a interface right now. I'm going to call that interface AddTeam repository. And now next, I'm going to actually go and create the class that is going to be our team repository. Now that we've created our interface and our repository, now we can go ahead and continue connecting the dots between the controller and the repository and the database. The next thing is we need to declare all our methods in our interface, and that's going to be our GetAllTeams, GetTeamById, AddTeam, DeleteTeam, EditTeam, all with their proper return types and tasks because they are all async awaits. Now we need to go to our team controller and actually declare an instance of this interface. How do we do that? Well, we're going to have private read only. And we're going to have an instance of this AddTeam repository in here. Now we need to initialize it, and we can do that in the constructor. So right here, we have the team repository, and here we are initializing it. Now, as you can see, all our errors are gone. We have our model in, so our controller is ready to go and waiting for our repository to actually get fully set up and actually have values to give the controller. So now let's actually go to our repository and start implementing these things. And I can show you guys some of the coolest updates that actually came with Entity Framework 7 that I don't feel like other people that have done these .NET 7 APIs have really touched. Now we're at our empty repository. First thing is I'm going to also go and in our global up here, I'm going to go and stick Entity Framework Core because we're going to be using it and I'd rather just have it globally there. Also, in the case that we were to have more repositories and had more controllers in this API, it would just make sense to have it globally and using it there. Why would I need it in every single repository declared? But now, the first thing that we need to do here is say that it is extending this interface and we're going to be implementing all of these methods. So let's kind of get these just base methods out here because these are all the ones that we need to implement. And again, I'm going to just move this to the front because we do not need it here. I don't want it to clog everything up. Let's just get it out of here. And just because I just now remembered, we need to go back and set up our SQL Server instance. Now that we've actually scaffolded in our context, let's go ahead and go do that. Before I forget again, let's go to our program and now set this right here. Let me get rid of this. Cool. Now we have our SQL Server and our database context all set up for right before when we actually start pulling data. So let's begin with the GetAllTeams method. That's an easy one. It's just pulling everything from the teams table. So first things first is we need an instance of the DB context. So let's create that variable here. Then we need to initialize this. So we can do that in the constructor very easily. We have that set now. Now let's actually get into the implementation of GetAllTeams. It is very straightforward. It is 2 lines of code. Here we go. We have our DB context. We're going to be going to the teams table and we're going to include the confederation information as well in case someone needed to also pull what confederation is from to get maybe an image of it. Who knows what they could do with it, but we also want to include the confederation it's a part of and to list async because we want to send them as a list back to our front end wherever they may be. And we do need to set this as async since we are using await. And that is how you get all teams. It is very simple, very straightforward method. Now let's do the same thing, but getting a team by a certain ID. And we're just going to be using a team ID that gets passed in. And this is again going to be 2 lines of code that we're going to be returning. Again, going to the teams table, we are again going to include the confederation, but we're going to say where the team ID equals the team ID, return the first match or default. And then we're just going to return that. And again, we have to set this as async. Now to change it up a little bit, let's go to our create a team, which is our add team. This one's going to be a little different using the team that we get from our controller. We're going to add that to the DB context teams table, add that in, save our changes, and then pass back the ID of our newly created team. We also need to go ahead and set this method as async, and this is all we need to get a new team from the front end or wherever it may come from, and then add it to our table, and now we have it in our database. And now what do we have left? Our delete and our edit. And I think my favorite update that comes with Entity Framework 7 has to do with updating and deleting. They've changed the way that you actually handle this, and they've cut down the amount of times you have to go to the database. They've cut down the lines of code, and they've just made it all around faster and smoother and easier to use, because edit and delete have been the same way for a while, but they've really cut it down. So let me show you guys the old way of how we've been doing edits and deletes, and now the new, better way that comes with Entity Framework 7. So let's begin with EditTeam. So this is going to be a team that we get, and we need to update some specific thing about it. In our case, it's going to be the name of the country. So what did the old code look like? Well, what do we usually do whenever we actually have to edit something? Well, the first thing that we do is we go into our database and we look for it. Do we find it? Cool. Give me back that item. And then what we do is we do whatever manipulation, whatever update that we need to, and then we save our changes and then return something, right? Return, the ID of what was changed, how many rows were changed, blah, 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 blah. But what if I told you, like I just mentioned earlier, that there's a better way? And there is a better way, and it's called bulk updates and bulk delete. Don't be as confused by the term bulk, as you can use this with just single tasks, single execution things that you don't have to have a trillion things going on. You can do it with just deleting one item. You can do it with just editing one thing. So how do you do that, and how do you cut down this code? Well, this is the exact line of code and what you actually have to run. This whole thing is replaced by one line. As you can see, what's about to happen here, and we need to return how many rows were affected. We now will call our DBContext, our table again, and then again, just like we were doing before, where, because we have to find that object, but now instead of returning an object and then manipulating it in our repository, what we're gonna do is call execute update async. This means it will find it in the database, manipulate it, change it, and then set it all in one go without ever coming back to the repository. So this basically cuts down on the amount of network traffic. You only go and do it in one go. You don't have to go multiple times back and forth to find and then edit it. And it just looks a lot nicer and it's cleaner. And then in here, you just set the property that you want to update. And if you needed to do more, you can just do a comma and continue setting properties. I think this really shines for kind of simple and quick updates. I think if you had like a ton of different manipulation and stuff like that, this might get a little confusing to read, but I think it is very nice and very elegant and definitely much better than bringing it back, manipulating, and then sending it back again. I think this is just much better just having it in one go. And there's something very similar for delete. So now let's go back to delete. And again, how did we used to do delete? Well, you would do kind of the same thing. You would go and find the item you want to delete. And once you find your item to delete, you would call remove on the table, and then you would save your changes. So again, 3 lines of code. Well, they've done something very similar as they did to edit with delete. And it looks like this. You can replace all this code with one line. And then we do need to return our rows affected, because that's what the integer value is. Let's set this as async. And then what's going on here? So again, we're going to await on our DBContext team. We're going to find that value, that item that we're going to remove. But instead of returning it, we're going to execute delete async. This again, just like the update, will in the database, when Entity Framework is executing, run a SQL statement that will go ahead and just delete it. It won't bring it back. It won't waste any more time. It's just going to go ahead and delete it. And I think that's just wonderful, and it's going to return how many rows were affected, and we move on. This, I think, is just going to cut down on so much time. It just gets rid of something that was a little bit antiquated and just updates it, freshens it, and just makes it so much better. But that is how you do deletes and updates now in .NET 7 using Entity Framework 7. But now that we have everything set up, let's go ahead and run this project. But first, before I forget, I do need to go ahead and set my services and add my interface in my program. So before I get there, we need to add this. But now that we have this, everything should be good, and we should be able to now test our API. So now that I have my API running, let's test that everything works. Let's go and get our teams. Let's try that one out. Let's execute. And boom, as you can see, we got every single thing that was here from France all the way down to England. Let's go back to our table so that we can make sure that I got everything that I said I did. France all the way down to England. We got everything in that list. Cool. Now let's get France. Let's get the first one. Let's get GetTeamById. Let's try it out. Let's execute. And we were able to get France as well as the confederation and everything else inside of it, just like we did when we got all. Now the next thing that I want to do is actually create a new team that I want to include in the teams table. And then I also want it to reference correctly the confederation that it's in. Since Canada is also going to the World Cup, let's add Canada to the database. And its confederation ID is 1 for CONCACAF. Now let us execute. We're going to go through. We're going to see that we get response body 12 because this is the ID 12. So if we go back here, we refresh this, we're going to see Canada is being created with the reference to its proper confederation, which is CONCACAF, which is 1. So everything's good there. Now let's edit it. Let's say, oh, I didn't really want to do Canada. I wanted to do, I don't know, Costa Rica. Let's do Costa Rica. That's also in CONCACAF. And just to prove that this works as expected, like I said, that it goes in one go and it doesn't come back and, do other things, I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And then just for the future, I'm going to put a breakpoint here. So now let's actually edit the team, edit Canada, and set it to Costa Rica. So I went ahead and set the country name as Costa Rica and the team ID of 12, which if you guys remember was Canada's right here. So we should be able to update this value, and it should update before I even return anything from the repository. So on our breakpoint, once we step through, it should already go because like I said, everything happens on that execute update async. We don't need to come back and then it happens. No, we don't need to save changes. It just happens all on this. So let's step through and execute. Now we're here. We see that we have our team, Costa Rica 12. Let's step through once. We see that we get 1 row affected. If we go back to our database, before even continuing to run everything, we already have it changed. So like I said, guys, one go, one nice line of code. It's smooth, easy to read. You do an update, you set the property, and I just think this is just a great update for Entity Framework 7. And I'm going to show you guys the same thing for delete. Now we step through. Now we actually get our value back over here. We see that we got our 1 row affected, which we already saw our database was correct in the update. And now let's actually do delete. Let's get rid of Costa Rica. It was a whole mistake. Didn't need to be there. So let's go back and go to our team ID of 12. As we remember, that is now Costa Rica here. And we need to now execute. We got our team ID 12, step through. Now it's already gone. It's already gone. We didn't need to save nothing. It's gone already. Click it. Boom. It's already gone. Step through. And 1 row affected. And it is gone from the database. Well guys, that is how you create a .NET 7 API that also uses Entity Framework 7. I showed you guys all the little changes that happen when you're just creating an API just because it's a new version of .NET and a new version of Entity Framework, as well as I got really excited about the changes to, the updating and deleting. I think those are excellent. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be using those going forward. And all the code to this should be on my GitHub, and the link to that should be in the description. And you guys may now be sitting around thinking, well, what's next? What do I do with this API? Well, you might want to host it in the cloud, right? So others can have access to it. Well, watch this video for how to deploy your .NET API to Azure.